Today we will be discussing about the introduction to disasters, its definition and why in the world we're preparing for it. Disasters by definition, by nature, overwhelm all available resources. We use the word disaster a lot. We usually utter the expression, today was a real disaster, or that exam was a disaster. But a true disaster, large or small, overwhelms all of your preparations, all of your plans, and all of your available resources. And this will be our presentation outline for this lecture. We will have the definition of terms, the basic terms, disaster risk profile, the impacts of a disaster to the Philippines, the different groups of natural disasters, and about disaster management and the disaster cycle itself. So first, let's define what climate change is. Climate change is a long-term change in the average weather patterns that have come to define Earth's local, regional, and global climates. These changes have a broad range of observed effects that are synonymous with the term. Okay. Also, disasters, being natural or technological, can occur as a result of anthropogenic activities. They happen when an extreme natural or technological event coincides with vulnerable human settlements. So disaster, by definition, is defined as a serious disruption of the functioning of a community or society, causing widespread human, material, economic, or environmental losses that exceed the ability of the affected community to cope up using its own resources. Also, a disaster is a continuously unfolding situation marked by changing in urgency, scope, impact, the time of appropriate responders, and the responders' needs for information communication. So in essence, a disaster inappropriately affects the normalcy or functionality of any community or country being affected. So it usually leads to widespread destruction of lives and property with attendant economic implication. So lastly, let's define disaster cycle. Disaster cycle, this can also be called as disaster management cycle. This defines the cyclical process of actions required to manage risk and impacts in places prone to disasters and emergencies. The geographical location of the Philippines make the country uniquely exposed to a plethora of hazards, including recurrent typhoons, earthquakes, and 53 active volcanoes, eruptions of which are classified as the most deadly and costly globally. So this is largely due to the location and geographical context as, as the risk involving coastal hazards such as typhoons, storm surges, and rising sea levels is high. So also, as the islands are located within the ring of fire between the Eurasian and Pacific tectonic plates, earthquakes and volcanoes are posing serious risks to the safety of the populace. So, yeah, we all know that our country, Philippines, is an archipelago state, and this covers approximately a land area of 300,000 square kilometer. So in terms of disaster risk, Philippines ranked third among all of the countries with the highest risks worldwide. So that's according to the World Risk Report 2018. And at least 60% of the country's total land area is exposed to multiple hazards, and 74% of the population is susceptible to their impact. Okay. So speaking of hazards, disasters in the past measured during the period between 1900 to 2014, it illustrates extreme spatial variability. So frequency and the extent of impacts are unevenly distributed across the regions. With majority of the events, it affects Central Luzon, the Cordillera Administrative Region, and Central Visayas. So there are an average of 20 tropical cyclones per year enter the Philippines or the Philippine waters, and with approximately 8 or 9 making landfall. So they are also the largest contributors to disaster damage. Of all disasters, cyclones and accompanying landslides, storm surges, and floods have caused the largest losses of life and property. Mostly because majority of the population is living within 60 kilometers from the coast. However, 80% of the damages and deaths caused by the typhoons between 1970 to 2014 have been caused by 6 superscale events. So these are, we all know the Haiyan, no, Typhoon Haiyan, and other mga superscale events. So based on vulnerability studies, the most vulnerable regions to tropical cyclones in the country are the NCR. We have the Southern Tagalog, the Cagayan Valley, the Central Luzon, the CAR, and Bicol Province. Well, for Visayas and Mindanao are likewise becoming more at risk due to an increasing number of tropical cyclones entering the southern part of the country. So, furthermore, the varying geomorphology affects the distribution of hazards. So, in the aspect of geomorphology, take for example, Baguio District. It's the most landslide-prone region due to highest recorded rainfalls resulting from the interaction of monsoon seasons, cyclones, and the orographic lifting of air by the Cordillera Mountains. So, severe reoccurring flooding, on the other hand, is common in the lowland areas or mga low-lying areas. There are also earthquakes. No? Earthquakes also tend to have their unique characteristics depending on the local context. So seismic activity produces severe secondary impacts in areas with cohesionless soil conditions. Also, we have what we call liquefaction, which is a significant concern in Central Luzon, especially in the provinces of Pangasinan and Tarlac. Extremely destructive earthquakes and associated tsunamis have been known to occur during the known history and are likely a threat in the near future or in the future. In terms of climate, the Philippines is among the top countries at risk of adverse impacts of climate change due to sensitive ecological systems. So that includes reefs and marine fauna. So large numbers of coastal populations and exposure to frequent weather extremes which are likely to grow in intensity. So I'd like to show you this thematic map. So this is from German Watch. Now, the German Watch gathered data and represented this, the data that they have gathered in a form of map, or it could also be in tabular, and they make reports out of it. So these figures, the two figures that you can see, can answer who suffers most from extreme weather events. Okay, so this global climate risk index, it contains analysis to what extent countries and regions have been affected by impacts of weather-related loss events. It could be storms, floods, heat waves, etc. Human impacts or fatalities and direct economic losses were analyzed in the most recent data available. So that's for 2019, from 2000 to 2019. These were taken into account. So the index result here represents one important piece in the overall puzzle of climate-related impacts and the associated vulnerabilities. The index focuses on extreme weather events such as storms, floods, and heat waves, but does not take into account important slow onset processes such as rising sea levels or ocean warming and acidification. So this is actually based on past data, and this should not be used as basis of linear projection of future climate impacts. So more specifically, not too far-reaching conclusions should be drawn for the purpose of political discussions regarding which country or region is the most vulnerable to climate change. So it is important to note that the occurrence of a single extreme event cannot be easily attributed to anthropogenic climate change. So nevertheless, climate change is an increasingly important factor for changing the likelihood of the occurrence and the intensity of these events. So let's look at, I hope you can see, no? Let's look at the table. The countries and territories affected most in 2019 were Mozambique, Zimbabwe, as well as Bahamas. Okay, and we are ranked fourth, no, in that table. So these years, for this data, the analysis reconfirms earlier results of the Climate Risk Index. So you can check their reports sa German Watch. They are publishing reports every year with regards to Global Climate Risk Index. So less developed countries are generally more affected than industrialized countries. Regarding the future climate change, the Climate Risk Index may serve as a red flag for already existing vulnerability that may further increase in regions where extreme events will become more frequent or more severe due to climate change. Also, I forgot to mention that for the period 2000 to 2019, Puerto Rico, Myanmar, and Haiti ranked highest. So we are next to Haiti. Okay. So climate change are considered, effects are considered to be a key factor contributing to the occurrence of stronger typhoons, sea level rise, and elevated storm surges in coastal regions. Intensified storm surges are predicted to affect more than 40% of the coastal population living in informal settlements, and they are likely to face the first impacts of increased storm surges and flooding. So there are studies that indicate that temperature and precipitation, the temperature and precipitation have increased steadily during the past 6 decades, and temperature extremes are becoming more frequent. Data also illustrates temporal and spatial variability of rainfall, which has unique regional characteristics of increased precipitation and central regions. However, the country has undergone an overall climatological drying trend outside of the monsoon. So these changes are reflected in, these can be manifested in rice production losses, as the crops are most sensitive to temperature changes, and in some extent to typhoons and excessive flooding. So production variability in the past has largely correlated with soil moisture changes, indicating the future droughts may pose the highest risk to crop yields and thus to national food security. So conversely, increased monsoonal precipitation will likely increase the risk of flash flooding and landslides. Okay, so let's talk about the impacts of a disaster. So not only earthquake, as you can see, this is just an example of a disaster that we are experiencing here in the Philippines, but there are even more natural hazards, na present. We have flooding, landslides, droughts, earthquakes, and tsunamis that further contribute to the exposure to natural hazards. So we have economic impact. Since 1990, the Philippines has been affected by 565 disaster events, which have caused an estimated of $23 billion in damages. Approximately 85.2% of the sources of the country's production have been reported to be susceptible to disasters, and 50.3% of the total land area is considered to be economically at risk. So there are large-scale and recurrent disasters that have long-term implications on the country's economy. So as you can see here, the estimated multi-hazard annual losses are close to $8 million, which is equivalent of, if we translate that one into our country's social expenditure, that would be 69%. Okay, so one of the most severe disasters to directly hit the Philippines in the recent history is the Typhoon Haiyan in 2013. So it affected an estimated 16 million people, destroyed more than 1.1 million houses, and affected hundreds of thousands of hectares of crops across 41 provinces. So much of the damage has been resulting from recurrent massive super-scale typhoons, including we have Ondoy, the Pepeng in 2009, Washi or Sandong in 2011. We also have Bofa, local name is Pablo in 2012, and the Super Typhoon Haiyan or Yolanda in 2013. And Kopo, Lando in 2015. We also have Haima in 2016, Mangkut in 2018. So much of the country's exports and trade income have relied on the resource extractive industry, which further create implications in terms of disaster vulnerability and sustainable economic growth. So we experienced damage to agricultural and fishing sector. These sectors are greatly affected. So such impacts had far-reaching economic consequences due to lessened future production, which in turn decreased the annual GDP. However, it has been suggested that the greatest losses are not due to the impact on agriculture. Large-scale typhoons have impaired the GDP growth due to disrupted electricity production infrastructure. affecting the output of industry, manufacturing, and services in the long term. So for the majority of the population, rice is the prime source of calories nationally. Thus, large-scale disaster affecting production may have a detrimental impact on the food supply of a national scale. The Typhoon Haiyan caused an estimated loss of 260,000 tons, leading to severe food shortages across the country. And approximately 2.5 million people required food assistance, and roughly a million farmers' livelihood were compromised as over 67,000 hectares of rice crops were destroyed. So it was estimated that the event drove nearly 1 million people into poverty. So also, large supply gap of rice has been emerging as a result of crop vulnerabilities, climate change, and inefficiencies in production and growing populations. And now, the domestic production is not meeting the demand. So we have our second point here for the social impact, that the poorest often suffer the most serious consequences of disaster and the losses of livelihoods. So at the household level, poverty is the most important factor determining vulnerability, which is reflected in the access of basic services and resources. You have location of housing, yearly earnings, and so on. Okay, so when it comes to education, children regularly lose school days and suffer the compounding negative effects on their schooling during disasters. Schools are often used as evacuation centers. Buildings are damaged, teaching materials are lost or damaged, even the books, no, the wooden chairs, it's all damaged, schedules are disrupted, and returning to schooling might be impossible for children from low-income backgrounds. So this has even longer-term cascading impacts, as lack of educational background may foretell increased vulnerability in the future. So even in this time of pandemic, it is hard for many kids to go back to school or to stay on track with regards to their education because of the transition that is happening right now. Natural disasters can be grouped into the following. So we have meteorological events, which comprises of the tropical storm, extratropical storm, convective storm, and local storm. We also have the hydrological events, the flood and mass movement. The climatological events, the extreme temperature, drought, forest fire, and we have geophysical events, which includes earthquake, tsunami, and volcanic activities. So I'm sure that if not all, most of us has been affected by disasters, and we can really see the effect or how disasters affect our nation, the country, the people, through the news, the Facebook posts that we can see, and we've looked at disasters for a long time, and even if you go back to prehistoric times, say for example, there is a small colony or a group of people, tribe of people that live close to a river or a low-lying area, and then a flood occurred. People's reaction, people living in that area, their reaction would be to take everything they have and then they move on to a higher ground. So that is the first disaster cycle. We consider that as a disaster cycle. They settled in one place, they had a good life, disaster happened, they learned from it. Okay, so we cannot live in this area anymore. So we have to move to a higher ground, and from that higher ground, they develop a good life up there, and they learn from what transpired from the past. Okay? So disaster management aims to reduce, avoid the potential losses from hazards. It assures prompt and appropriate assistance to victims of disaster and achieve rapid and effective recovery. So the disaster management cycle that I will show you later illustrates the ongoing process by which governments, businesses, and civil society plan for and reduce the impact of disasters, react during and immediately following a disaster, and take steps to recover after a disaster has occurred. So appropriate actions at all points in the cycle lead to greater preparedness, better warnings, reduced vulnerability, or the prevention of disasters during the next iteration of the cycle. So the complete disaster management cycle includes shaping of the public policies. We have a lot of disaster policies and plans that either modify the causes of disasters or mitigate their effects on people, property, and infrastructures. That's why our LGUs or the different organizations or functions in the government creates mga reports, or even after a disaster na sila yung mga incident, what do you call that one? Mga damage reports na kailangan i-file, i-submit, because these are, we can learn from this, we can learn from the disasters that have already occurred in the past. Okay. So this is the disaster cycle, or the disaster management cycle. This is a model that is well established. We have the mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery. First, the mitigation. The mitigation comprises a different set of activities to help prevent or reduce the vulnerability of a society to the impact of a disaster. In other words, it is geared toward forestalling catastrophic events. Then we have the preparedness. Preparedness refers to the steps undertaken by government, responder agencies, and non-governmental organizations or NGOs to ensure that the immediate impact in case of disaster occurrence is reduced to the barest minimum. And can also demonstrate the level of alertness to disaster threats responses, are the activities taken to reduce the immediate and short-term impact of a disaster event. So the mitigation and preparedness phases occur as a disaster management improvements are made in anticipation of a disaster event. So developmental considerations play a key role in contributing to the mitigation and preparation of a community to effectively confront a disaster. And we have response and recovery phase. Remember that the main focus is to save lives, meet basic human needs, and prevent further destruction of properties. So response, by definition, are the efforts to minimize the hazards created by disaster. It could be examples of this are search and rescue, emergency relief. Another examples would be evacuation, sheltering, medical service, communication, law enforcement, and others. So multi-agencies are usually involved in response efforts, making the time coordination of their effort a management issue. So collaboration and timely information sharing between multi-responders and disaster agencies can be determined by a successful management of a disaster. Okay, so dapat na ay collaboration and information sharing, or else mag-overlap ang mga present available information, and it will create chaos or confusion sa pag-manage sa disaster. We also have the recovery. That means returning the community to normal, or what could be the new normal. No? Examples are temporary housing grants, medical care, so like that. So as a disaster occurs, this is disaster management actors, in particular, humanitarian organizations, become involved in the immediate response and long-term recovery phases. So the 4 disaster management phases illustrated here do not always or even generally occur in isolation or in this precise order. Often, the phases of the cycle overlap, and the length of each phase greatly depends on the severity of the disaster. So sometimes recovery will take too long. No? A very slow process. Recovery is a very slow process. Okay. Okay. So before moving to the hard truths about disasters, let me tell you about this satellite image. This is from Japan. On March 11, 2011, a massive earthquake of magnitude 9.0 jolted the eastern coast of Japan. So an hour after the earthquake, a 14 to 15 meters tsunami hit the Pacific coastline and led to a terrible loss of lives. So there are approximately 19,000 people died or remain unaccounted for. It also led to loss of all on-site power sources, resulting in serious accidents at the 3 operating Fukushima Daiichi units, which were classified by the Japanese authorities as level 3 on the International Nuclear and Radiological Event Scale. So while technological events are direct results of anthropogenic activities, there are points of intersections around the natural and technological disasters. So this is one of the example. The devastating earthquake was an example of such a disaster. As the earthquake was followed by a tsunami, it ultimately crippled the nuclear power plants. And the Japanese disaster clearly shows the intersection between human error, technological inefficiency, and unexpected natural disaster. Okay. So these are the hard truths about disaster. Whether natural, technological, or human-induced, disaster can be catastrophic in nature, clearing out any and all obstacles along its path. They are considered very interruptive to the development process as lives are lost. Lives are lost, social networks are disrupted, capital investments are destroyed, and development funds are diverted to relief, rescue, reconstruction, and recovery efforts. So further, disasters impede progress towards social and economic growth. It drains investments and divert funds from federal, state, municipal governments, and aid agencies' budget coffers into response and recovery activities. So these funds would have been otherwise used for other development projects, It could be mga other programs and activities leading to the jeopardized long-term development goals and sustainability. So, however, the negative effects and impacts can be mitigated if pre, during, and post-disaster response activities and measures are planned and implemented. Okay, so, um, I will repeat the last sentence. The negative effects and impacts of disasters can be mitigated if pre, during, and post-disaster response activities and measures are planned and implemented. So that would be the end of my presentation for lecture 1. So thank you very much for listening.